This video will discuss Python lists. If you're familiar with lists in Scratch, you may remember that over here on the left where I have an image of how you create lists, there was a little place where you would click a button and you would create this list. So you need code to do this in Python. Here's what it could look like. If you want to create an empty list, you just give it a name, use the equal operator, and you use these square brackets. So notice they're squared off ends. You could also put items in it. It doesn't have to be an empty list. And here is just two different strings, but you can put any sort of object in there. I've got list item A and list item B. If you want to add things to the list, just as a reminder of how we did this in Scratch, we use their add block, and you would say, what is the thing you want to put in that list? You could also insert, you could also replace items if you knew their index. And if you remember how that works, so you have a list of items in a list. So here's an item, here's an item. Now this is a difference between Scratch and Python. In Scratch, if the first item in the list was number 1 and the second item in the list was number 2 and so on. What's different about Python, like many other languages, that first item is index 0, then the next item is index 1 and so on. So it starts at 0 and counts up. So you just have to be careful here when you think about which index you want for an item. But here's an example of adding something to the end of a list. You would say mylist.append, which is a method on list objects, and then what it is you want to add. And in this case, I'm adding string list item C. If I want to insert an item at a certain index, you use the insert method. The first is the index and then the thing you want to add. But remember, this 2 here is really going to add it at the third item, as the third item in the list. You can also set values. If you want to put something in, you can say my list and then use this square bracket with the index number in it. It says take whatever is at the 0th index, which would be the first item in the list in this case, and change it, put something else in there. Let's talk a little bit more about list indices. Indices are just the plural for the word index. So again, Scratch, while they start with counting as 1, 2, 3, Python starts with 0. So 0, 1, 2 is how you'd reference those. So here's an empty list. My list equals 2 brackets with nothing in them. And again, notice they're square brackets. But I also could create it by putting things in there. So my list, and I'm putting in 2 different strings here. So this would be item 0, index 0. This would be index 1. Now I can append an item here. So I'm going to have a third item in that list using index number 2, really, right? So 0 is item A, 1 would be item B, and 2 would be item C. Now the insert, what that does is it starts at index 2, and it's going to insert something in between. 2 is actually the third place. So at 3, I'm going to now put this list item D. And anything that already was there kind of gets pushed to the right, so it kind of goes inserted in between them. Now, if you want to replace something, you can just reference that index exactly. So my list 0, changing that first item. So if I were to print out the list, I'm printing out here is the list, and you can see that in blue on the bottom there, print my list. So changing the first list item, that's coming from this one. It said take the first item in the list, item 0, and change it. So that's what we're seeing first. Now item B, so this was the original first item. So this was the next one. So we see that next. Now item D comes next because I inserted it in the third position. Even though this says a number 2, that is the third position in the list. So that's why we see list item D next. And list item C used to be there, so it got pushed to the right. So you may have to look at this a little bit again, just to kind of really think it through, or even better, play with it in Codesters or some other Python environment and just kind of get used to what it's actually doing. All right, and if you need the length, let's say I need a length of a list in Scratch, we had a little length of function. So it's same idea in Python. There's a len function, and then you put in a list, and it'll return the number. So if I have a list and it has A, B, and C as 3 different items, if you take the length of that list, you'd get a 3 back. To delete items, there's a number of different ways here. So this would be how we could do it in Scratch. You can delete by index, and there again, their indices work a little different. This would get rid of the first thing in the list in Scratch. This gets rid of everything. So if you want to get rid of the first one in Python, here would be a statement that would do that. del my list, and again, the first one you're going to start with 0. You can also delete a range, and range can be a little bit confusing. It says delete everything in the list starting at 0 and up to but not including list item 2, which is, if you recall, is the third item in the list. So it's actually going to get rid of list items 0 and 1. And when it gets to 2, it kind of stops. It won't do 2. It's complicated, I know. So you're maybe play with that one a little bit too if you ever want to do that. I have this here as a comment. We're using Python 2.7 in CodeStars, but if you ever are using a later version of Python, there is a clear command as well. And so let's see what happens here. I've got my list. It's got 2 things in it now, list item A and list item B. And if I print it out, I would see these items. Now, if I delete my list, and I'm using this kind of funny range thing, that says get rid of everything in the list. And then you print it, you would see that it's gone. So this is a little weird looking, but it does the same thing as the delete all. So I've got a list here, and I'm putting in 4 things: apple, orange, banana, and pear. If I want to get a value in that list, if you know the index, you can just reference it. So if I want the second item in the list, I have to use index 1, because remember we started 0, so 0 would be first and 1 would be second. And I can either print it or store it. I'm putting it in a variable here, and if I print it out, I'm going to get the second item in the list, which is orange, which is why we see that. If you want to get the index, let's say you don't know what the index is, but you do know the value you're looking for, that happens sometimes. You could say, hey, I wonder what index number banana is. You could just say, hey, my list.index. Find the thing with that and give me the index value back. So here is banana. So it's the 0, 1, 2, second index element in there. So that's why you're getting an output of 2. Now, iterating through a list. Iterating just means you're going through a list trying to visit every single item in the list. So here is an example of that. I'm using a for loop here for list item, so it's just using a variable that's going to keep track of each item as you visit in my list. Every time this loop goes, every time it runs, list item gets that next element in the list. So it starts with the first one, the next time through it gets the second one, the third one, or the 0 index, 1 index, 2 index, and so on. So here, this is just a way to print out the list if you wanted to, but sometimes there are reasons why you want to visit things in a list, so this is a way to do it. Here's an example I wrote on how to average numbers, say, in a list. What I did here was first I defined a little function here called average number list, and it's going to take a number list in as input, and I put a nice comment here to tell me so I can remember what these things are, and it returns the average of those numbers. So let's just quickly go through what it's doing here. I'm initializing a variable called average, and I'm just giving it some value. I tried to give it some unlikely value, so if you get this when you come back, it probably means something didn't work right. I do a quick check to make sure I have things in a list. So if you have a non-zero element list, there are things in this list. Here's what we're going to do. Now, this first comment shows a very fast way to do what I'm about to do next. You can use a sum function if you want to add up numbers in a list. I didn't do it that way because I wanted to show you what it might look like to iterate through a list or go through each element. Here is just another way. So I have a variable called sum of numbers. I'm initializing it to 0. And now I want to add up all the numbers. I have one of those for loops. So I have a variable number in list, and it gets reset each time through the loop, and it gets set with a new list item each time. So the first time through, it's going to have the first item in the list. So sum of numbers, which starts at 0, plus equals. So add to sum of numbers that first number in the list. And then I go back up. The second time through, I have the second item in the list, and it's just going to add that into my running sum that I've got going. And it's just going to keep doing that until I get all my numbers. So when this loop finishes, sum of numbers should be the sum of all those numbers that were in the list. And then I just divide by the number of things that I have. I'm using this word float, this little float function, to turn this integer into a floating point number, because when I do my division here, I'm going to divide by however many numbers there were in the list. I don't want it to do an integer division because that can truncate or take away the decimal places, and I want to have everything in there. So I have to remember to make that a float. And then I return that average. That's what comes back. Underneath, I'm just setting up the call to it. So I'm creating a grades list, and I'm putting some some values in there. So let's say those are 5 grades you got at school and you want the average. So I'm calling the average number list and then I'm printing it out. So what basically happens is it's going to take all these numbers, it's going to run it through here, and then you get your average. So again, this is just an example. It's just a thing for you to look at if you're working with lists. I have a little challenge for some of you if you're up for it. If you are one of my students, one of our previous assignments was to write a rock, paper, scissors program. And it was in Python and it was very text-based. So we didn't use any of the fancy graphics that are supplied with Codesters. I just wanted you to use pure Python. So I have an example here of a program that I wrote. So what I want you to do is I want you to update your rock, paper, scissors program so that I can remember what all the choices were previously. So you play this game, you choose rock, the computer chooses paper, and so the computer wins. And so we're keeping track of the different rounds here. So what I did to mine is I added a new choice of what you can type in. You can say, hey, could you just show me the history? And so it's showing my move history, and it's saying, okay, the first round you chose rock, the computer chose scissors, you chose paper, and then they chose scissors again, and then finally you chose scissors and the computer chose paper. So it's just a way to kind of know what happened. So what happened in these different rounds? So use a list to keep track of these moves. It will remember everything that happened. If you want to do this on a previous project, you certainly can. So I did mine on rock, paper, scissors. Maybe we did an interactive story where people were able to type in, I want to go to the moon, or I want to go to the park, or something like that. You can keep track of what they input, anything you want, just something that's going to use a list to remember what a player or user input into a program. So rock, paper, scissors, I needed 2 lists, one for the player and one for the computer. If you're doing the interactive story or something like that, you'd only need 1 list. Maybe you did something more complicated, you might need more lists. Things to think about: what happens if they try to see a choice history before they've even done anything, so kind of account for that case. And also think about, when should you start recording the history? When would that be a good place for that? And I know this can be a little bit complicated and hard, and especially now when we're not at school and we're doing this on our own. So I do have an example of the code I wrote for my rock, paper, scissors. If you want to look at it, it's hard to click here when you're looking at a video, but you'll have a copy of these charts and you can click there. There's a lot in here. You may need to review them. I'll give you a copy of my slides, but enjoy working with lists. They can really make your project so much more interesting. Thank you for watching.